The sun cast a golden glow over the village of Id as the day of the prince's arrival dawned. Excitement buzzed through the air as maidens hurried to prepare themselves, eager for the opportunity to capture the attention of Prince Emeka, the kingdom's most sought-after bachelor. Brightly colored fabrics fluttered in the breeze as young women adorned themselves with the finest beads, their hair woven into intricate braids. Among them, however, there was one girl who did not share in the anticipation. Amina, a simple yet beautiful girl with a heart full of dreams, was far from the bustling village square where preparations were underway. Instead, she found herself burdened with chores, her stepmother ensuring that she remained out of sight and far from the prince's gaze. Amina had always been treated as an outsider in her own home. After her father's passing, her stepmother, Madame Ngozi, took every opportunity to diminish her worth. While her stepsisters, Bola and Chinyere, flaunted their beauty and indulged in luxury, Amina toiled away in the background, tending to household duties from dawn till dusk. The day of the prince's visit was no different. Just as Amina dared to dream of seeing the royal procession, her stepmother's sharp voice rang through the compound. "Amina! Stop your daydreaming and fetch water from the stream." Amina hesitated, glancing at the village square where laughter and music filled the air. "But stepmother," she began, only to be silenced by a withering glare. "Do not question me. You are not fit to be seen among the noble maidens. Now, go." Amina swallowed her disappointment, wrapped a scarf around her head, and picked up the heavy water pot before setting off down the dusty path. The journey to the stream was long, but Amina had grown accustomed to the solitude. The gentle rustling of leaves and the soft murmur of flowing water provided a rare moment of peace. As she knelt by the stream, dipping her pot into the cool water, she was unaware of the approaching figure. It wasn't until she heard the crunch of footsteps on the pebbled path that she looked up, her eyes widening in shock. Standing before her, dressed in regal attire, was Prince Emeka himself. The golden embroidery on his deep green robe shimmered in the sunlight, and his sharp, intelligent eyes studied her with quiet curiosity. "Hello there," he said, his voice smooth yet commanding. Amina's heart pounded as she quickly lowered her gaze and bowed. "My prince, forgive me, I did not see you approaching." The prince smiled slightly. "There is no need to apologize. I saw you from the path and wondered why you were here alone." Amina hesitated, unsure if she should tell him the truth. Would he mock her like the others? But something in his gaze reassured her. "I came to fetch water," she said softly. "It is my duty." Prince Emeka studied her for a moment, sensing something different about her. Unlike the maidens in the village square who had thrown themselves at him with rehearsed smiles and calculated gestures, Amina seemed genuine. "And do you wish to be at the square instead?" he asked. Amina glanced away, her fingers tightening around the rim of her water pot. "It does not matter what I wish, my prince." A sudden call from the village echoed through the trees, reminding Emeka that his presence was expected elsewhere. He turned his head briefly, but his gaze quickly returned to Amina. "Perhaps I will see you again," he said before stepping away, leaving Amina with a heart filled with wonder. As she watched him disappear into the distance, she couldn't help but feel that something had changed. She had not sought the prince's attention, yet he had noticed her. And somehow, she felt as though their paths were destined to cross again. Back in the village, the festivities were in full swing. Madame Ngozi and her daughters were beside themselves with excitement, convinced that the prince had taken notice of them. "He looked directly at me," Bola boasted, adjusting her beaded necklace. "Nonsense. He smiled at me when I greeted him," Chinyere retorted. Amina, having returned from the stream unnoticed, listened quietly as they spoke. Her mind, however, was elsewhere, replaying her unexpected encounter with the prince. She knew better than to hope for miracles, but for the first time in years, she allowed herself a fleeting dream. Meanwhile, at the palace, Prince Emeka sat in quiet contemplation. His advisors and attendants discussed the day's events, listing the names of the noble maidens who had been presented to him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He kept recalling the girl at the stream, the simplicity of her presence, and the honesty in her words. She had not tried to impress him, nor had she sought his attention. And yet, she had captivated him in a way no one else had. "Your Highness," his chief advisor spoke, breaking his reverie. "Have you made a decision?" Emeka shook his head. "Not yet. I need more time." The advisor sighed but nodded. "Very well, Your Highness. We will continue to visit other villages as planned." Emeka nodded absently, but deep in his heart, he knew he would return to it before making his final choice. He needed to see Amina again. The next morning, as Amina tended to the market stall with her stepmother, she noticed hushed whispers among the villagers. Eyes darted toward her before quickly looking away. Confused, she lowered her gaze, only to realize that even Madame Ngozi and her daughters had grown uncharacteristically silent. It wasn't long before she learned why. News had spread that Prince Emeka had asked about a girl he had met at the stream, describing her in detail. Whispers turned to murmurs, and soon, murmurs turned into realization Amina was the girl the prince had spoken of. Madame Ngozi's face darkened with fury as she dragged Amina away from the market stall. "You think you can outshine my daughters? You think you are worthy of the prince's attention?" She spat, her grip tightening on Amina's arm. "I will not allow it." That evening, as the village buzzed with excitement over the possibility of the prince's return, Madame Ngozi locked Amina in her room, ensuring she would not be present should the prince come searching for her. "You will stay here until the prince leaves our village," she hissed before slamming the door shut. But fate had other plans. Under the cover of night, a soft knock came at Amina's window. Heart pounding, she pushed it open, her breath catching as she found herself face to face with Prince Emeka. "Amina," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. "I had to see you again." Tears welled in Amina's eyes. "My prince, you should not be here." "And yet, here I am," he replied, his expression unwavering. "Amina, I have traveled across many villages, met countless maidens, but none have captured my heart the way you have. Come with me to the palace. Let me show you a life where you are valued, where you are loved." Amina hesitated, years of doubt and mistreatment making her question if she truly deserved such happiness. But as she looked into the prince's eyes, she saw nothing but sincerity. Summoning her courage, she reached for his outstretched hand. "Yes, my prince. I will go with you." As dawn broke over it, the village awoke to the news that Amina had been chosen by the prince. Madame Ngozi and her daughters could do nothing but watch as she rode away in a royal carriage, leaving behind the life of servitude she had always known. And so, Amina's story became one of hope, proving that even the most unexpected paths could lead to a destiny beyond imagination. The sun cast golden rays over the quiet village as Ebony walked barefoot along the narrow path leading to the stream, a worn clay pot balanced on her head. Her stepmother, Madame Ife, had sent her out early, making sure she carried more than her fair share of work while her stepsisters, Adana and Busy, lounged in the shade of their compound, laughing as they braided each other's hair. Ebony never complained. She had learned that silence was her greatest ally, that hard work was the only thing that kept her from feeling completely powerless in her own home. The stream was a place of solitude for her, a brief escape from the sharp words and cold stares that awaited her back home. Today, however, as she knelt by the water's edge, dipping her pot into the cool current, she heard the rustling of leaves and the soft murmur of voices. A sudden gust of wind carried a voice that was unfamiliar yet commanding, its tone both curious and amused. "You do not seem like the other girls in the village." Ebony's hands froze as she lifted her pot. She turned her head slightly, her heart pounding. Standing a few feet away was a man dressed in finely woven robes, his stance relaxed yet regal. His deep brown eyes studied her with an intensity that made her shift uncomfortably. She had never seen him before, but there was something about him that felt different. The whispers had traveled through the village about the prince's return, but never in her wildest dreams did she imagine she would encounter him alone at the stream. Prince Adewale tilted his head, waiting for her to respond. Amina lowered her gaze. "I am just here to fetch water, my prince," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "And yet, you carry yourself as though the weight of the world rests on your shoulders," he mused, stepping closer. "What troubles you?" Amina's fingers tightened around the handle of her pot. She had spent years learning to swallow her words, to push down her pain until it no longer had a voice. But in the presence of the prince, she found herself wanting to speak, to be seen, to be known. "Nothing, my prince. I only do as I am told," she finally replied. Adewale's expression did not change, but something in his eyes darkened, as if he understood more than she had said. "I will see you again," he said before turning and walking away, his royal guards emerging from the shadows of the trees to follow him. Amina stood motionless, her heart racing. She knew that nothing good would come from being noticed by the prince. If her stepmother found out, there would be consequences. That night, as she served food to Madame Ife and her daughters, she listened to their excited chatter about the upcoming festival at the palace. "Prince Adewale will be choosing a wife soon," Adana said, her eyes sparkling. "All the noble families are preparing their daughters." Madame Ife nodded approvingly. "We must ensure you both look your best. A prince deserves nothing less than a woman of class and beauty." Amina swallowed hard, forcing herself to remain invisible. She had no place in such conversations. Yet, she could not stop thinking about the way the prince had looked at her by the stream. The next day, as she walked through the marketplace, whispers followed her. "Did you hear? The prince was seen speaking to a girl at the stream." "Who was she?" "No one knows, but surely she is of little importance." Amina kept her head down, her face burning with shame and fear. Had she already been discovered? She hurried home, only to find Madame Ife waiting for her at the entrance, her expression tight with suspicion. "You have been attracting attention, Amina," she said, her voice dangerously low. "Do not think for a moment that you are anything more than a servant in this household. Do you understand?" Amina nodded quickly. "Yes, stepmother." That evening, she was sent to the stream again, as if to remind her of her place. But this time, as she filled her pot, she felt a presence behind her. "You avoided me today," the prince's voice broke the silence. Amina's breath hitched, and she turned slowly to face him. "I did not wish to cause trouble, my prince. And yet, trouble seems to follow you," he said, his lips curving into a slight smile. "Would you come to the festival?" Her eyes widened. "The festival? But I am not meant to attend such events. And yet, I am inviting you." Amina hesitated, knowing that accepting his invitation would mean facing her stepmother's wrath. But for the first time in her life, she felt seen. "If I can, I will come," she said at last. That night, she barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities. When the day of the festival arrived, Madame Ife and her daughters left the house dressed in their finest garments, unaware that Amina had managed to borrow a simple yet elegant gown from a kind neighbor. She wrapped a scarf around her hair and slipped into the festival unnoticed. The palace was grander than anything she had ever imagined. Music filled the air, laughter echoed through the halls, and the scent of roasted meats and sweet spices surrounded her. As she stepped forward, she caught sight of Prince Adewale standing among nobles, his eyes scanning the crowd. When he saw her, his face lit up, and without hesitation, he walked towards her, ignoring the stunned gasps of the onlookers. "You came," he said softly. "I wasn't sure if you would." "Neither was I," Amina admitted, her voice barely audible over the music. He reached for her hand, and a hush fell over the crowd. "Dance with me," he said. Amina hesitated, glancing around at the many pairs of eyes watching them. But when she looked back at the prince, she saw something in his eyes that made her forget her fear. She placed her hand in his, and he led her onto the dance floor. The world around them blurred as they moved, as if for the first time in her life, she was more than just a servant girl. She was someone. But not everyone was pleased. Madame Ife's face twisted with rage as she pushed through the crowd, grabbing Amina's wrist. "You have disgraced this family," she hissed. Prince Adewale's gaze hardened. "She has done nothing wrong," he said firmly. "She does not belong here." Madame Ife spat. "She is a nobody." Amina braced herself for humiliation, but before she could speak, the prince turned to the crowd. "From this day forward, Amina is under my protection," he announced, his voice strong and unwavering. "No one will mistreat her again." Gasps erupted, whispers filled the air. Madame Ife paled, stepping back as if struck. Amina stared at the prince, her heart pounding. "Why would you do this?" she whispered. He smiled, a warmth in his eyes that melted away all her fears. "Because I see you, Amina. And I will not let you be invisible any longer." In that moment, for the first time in her life, Amina believed that perhaps she was meant for something more. The cold water of the stream beat at Adoma's skin as she shivered, clutching her worn dress tightly around her. Her stepmother's harsh words still rang in her ears, the accusations of laziness and worthlessness echoing louder than the rush of water before her. She had spent the morning toiling under the scorching sun, gathering firewood and fetching water, yet it was never enough. No matter how hard she worked, Madame Dahlia always found fault, always sent her away with more demands, more punishments. This time, she had been ordered to the stream at dusk, forced to scrub clothes until her fingers were raw. She did not complain, for there was no one to listen, no one to care. But as she bent over the water, she heard the sound of hoofs approaching. She turned sharply, startled to see a group of horsemen slowing near the clearing. At the front rode a man dressed in fine garments, his presence exuding an air of authority and nobility. Prince Idris had been traveling through the village on his usual inspection, though his thoughts were far from his royal duties. He was weary of the endless talk of potential brides, of the noble daughters paraded before him like rare gems, all polished and perfect but lacking the fire he longed to see. He was about to ride past the stream when something, or rather, someone caught his eye. A young woman, her sleeves rolled up, her dark curls falling loosely around her face, was scrubbing clothes with an intensity that spoke of more than just duty. She looked exhausted, yet she carried herself with quiet strength. Something about her drew him in, and before he realized what he was doing, he had dismounted and approached. She turned, startled, her wide eyes locking onto his, and in that moment, Idris felt a strange pull, as if fate had intended for their paths to cross. Adoma quickly averted her gaze, her heart pounding. What was the prince doing here? Was she in trouble for being seen in such a state? She dropped her hands, feeling suddenly self-conscious about her tattered dress and careless fingers. "My lord," she whispered, lowering herself into a quick bow, her mind racing with thoughts of what punishment might await her. But instead of reprimand, his voice was gentle. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then spoke, "Adoma, my prince." He nodded, his dark eyes studying her. "Why are you working so late?" She swallowed hard, unsure if she should speak the truth. "Because I must," she finally answered, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. Something flickered in his expression, pity, perhaps, or admiration. You work hard, he said. Too hard. She let out a short, humorless laugh. I have no choice, my prince. Idris was silent for a long moment, then said, Perhaps you do. Before she could ask what he meant, he turned to one of his guards. Prepare a horse for her. Adoma gasped. My prince, I cannot. You can, he interrupted. And you will. You should not be treated like a servant in your own home. Fear gripped her chest. If she left, what would her stepmother do? What would the villagers say? But before she could protest further, he extended his hand. Trust me, he said simply. She hesitated, then, with a deep breath, she placed her hand in his. The warmth of his touch sent a shiver through her, and in that moment, she knew her life was about to change forever. The journey to the palace felt surreal. She rode beside the prince, her heart a storm of emotions. The guards whispered among themselves, casting curious glances at her, but she kept her gaze ahead. When they arrived, she was led inside, her feet barely touching the marble floors as she took in the grandeur of the place. Servants rushed forward, offering her food, warm water, a change of clothes, but she was too overwhelmed to speak. Idris watched her closely, sensing her unease. You are safe here, he assured her. No one will harm you. She nodded, but her mind was still reeling. What would come next? Why had he brought her here? The answer came sooner than she expected. The next morning, she was summoned to the grand hall, where the royal court had gathered. Whispers filled the air as she entered, her simple dress a stark contrast to the silks and jewels adorning the nobles. At the far end of the room, Idris stood beside his father, the king. His voice carried through the hall as he spoke, his words sending shockwaves through the crowd. This woman has endured hardships no one should face. Yet she remains strong, kind, and full of dignity. It is for this reason that I have chosen her as my bride. Gasps erupted from the nobles. Adoma felt her breath catch in her throat. No! A sharp voice rang out. She turned to see a woman stepping forward, Lady Nafisa, the daughter of a powerful duke. Her expression was one of pure fury. You cannot be serious, my prince. She is nothing. A commoner, a servant. Idris's gaze hardened. She is more than that. She is more than all of you who judge her by status alone. Lady Nafisa's face twisted with rage, but the king raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. He turned his keen eyes on Adoma. Do you accept this, child? Her throat felt dry, her mind spinning. Was this real? Was this truly happening? She glanced at Idris, his steady gaze anchoring her. Then, with a deep breath, she spoke. Yes, my king. A stunned silence filled the hall before the king gave a slow nod. Then it shall be. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Tailors dressed her in the finest garments, tutors instructed her in courtly manners, and whispers followed her wherever she went. Some admired her rise, others despised it. Lady Nafisa and her allies made no secret of their disdain, attempting to humiliate her at every turn. But Adoma held her head high, remembering the hardships she had faced, knowing she had earned her place not through privilege but through resilience. Idris stood by her side, his presence unwavering, his words a constant source of comfort. You are stronger than all of them, he told her one night as they walked through the palace gardens. That is why I chose you. On the day of their wedding, the kingdom gathered to witness the union. Adoma stood before the altar, her heart pounding, her mind flashing back to the stream where it had all begun. She met Idris's gaze, finding reassurance in his warm smile. Are you ready? He asked softly. She nodded. I am. As they exchanged vows, as the cheers of the crowd rang through the air, Adoma knew her journey was only beginning. She had been sent to the stream as a castaway, an unwanted girl, but she had emerged as a woman who had captured the heart of a prince. And as she stood by his side, she knew she would rule not with power alone, but with the same strength and kindness that had brought her here.